Welcome to my channel. My name is Sophia Harper, and tonight I am going to tell you a story about a son who was called a mistake, and the night he decided he would never accept that name again. My name is Omar Rahman. I am 31 years old, and for most of my life, I answered to a title that was never written on any birth certificate, but lived in every room I entered. The family mistake. My brother Ayan was the miracle, the heir, the pride of the Rahman name. He was the one teachers remembered, the one neighbors pointed to when they spoke about potential, the one my father introduced with a hand on his shoulder and a voice full of steel and certainty. This is my son, this is my legacy. When he said my name, it was different, softer, distracted, like he was checking something off a list. Omar is also here. That was enough to build a hierarchy inside a house with high ceilings and imported marble floors. I grew up in a home where silence meant survival and excellence meant competition. Our father built Rahman Holdings from a single textile warehouse into a logistics empire that stretched across 3 ports and 4 cities. He liked to say he built it with blood and instinct. What he meant was he trusted no one except the son who looked most like him. Ayan had his jaw, his temper, his hunger. I had my mother's patience and my grandmother's eyes, which in our house counted for very little. When we were boys, Ayan would win debates at school, and father would take him out for steak dinners. I would fix the broken irrigation system at the warehouse on a Sunday afternoon, and father would nod once, as if I had done the bare minimum required to remain oxygenated. The difference was never dramatic, it was precise, it was measured in tone, in attention, in who got invited into the study after dinner, and who was told to clear the plates. I learned early that approval in our house was a currency, and I did not print it. Ayan did not hate me. He did not need to. The system did the work for him. He was expected to lead. I was expected to adapt. He went to London for his MBA with a send-off party that looked like a political fundraiser. I stayed back to help mother through her second surgery and ran the secondary distribution unit, quietly increasing margins by 7% in 8 months. No one threw a party for that. They did not even notice. The first time I heard the phrase family mistake, I was 19. It was not said to my face, it was said through a door. My father and uncle were in the study discussing succession planning. Uncle Farid asked what would happen if Ayan decided not to return from London. My father laughed, a short, dismissive sound. Ayan will return. He knows what he is. If he does not, then we have Omar. But that would be a mistake. The word landed differently when it was attached to your name. It did not echo, it sank, it became sediment. I did not confront him. I did what I had always done. I made myself useful. I learned the business from the floor up. I memorized freight routes, negotiated minor contracts, fixed inefficiencies no one else cared to see. I became indispensable in ways that were invisible. Invisible work is still work. It just does not come with applause. When our mother died 3 years ago, the house changed in texture. She had been the only person who looked at both of us without comparison. In her absence, the competition sharpened. Ayan returned for the funeral and stayed. He moved into father's study as if it had been waiting for him, and perhaps it had. Within 6 months, he was appointed executive director. The board vote was unanimous. I was named operations manager, which sounded important until you realized it meant cleaning up other people's strategic errors. My father began hosting monthly dinners for investors at the house, crystal glasses, polished silver laid out precisely. Ayan seated at his right hand. I sat wherever there was space, which was usually near the end of the table, where conversations thinned into polite exchanges about weather and traffic. It was at one of those dinners that the sentence was finally delivered. Not behind a door, not softened by distance, but directly across a table lit by chandeliers. The night my brother called me the family mistake, I remember every detail, because humiliation sharpens memory. The investor was a man named Khalid Mansour, who controlled access to a shipping corridor we had been trying to secure for months. He asked a routine question about our internal restructuring. Ayan answered with confidence, then gestured vaguely in my direction. Omar handles some of the smaller adjustments. He said he prefers to stay out of the spotlight. I opened my mouth to clarify that I had designed the entire restructuring model, but before I could speak, Ayan laughed lightly and added, every family has one son built for the stage and one built for the shadows. We love him anyway. It was said as a joke. The table responded with polite laughter. My father did not correct him. He lifted his glass and said, results matter, and Ayan delivers. Then he looked at me as if to assess whether I would cause discomfort. I did not. I lowered my eyes and let the laughter pass over me like weather, but something inside me shifted. It was not anger. I had been angry before, Anger is loud and hot and exhausting. This was colder. It was clarity. I saw the structure of my life in that moment, the roles, the expectations, the ceiling. I understood that no amount of quiet excellence would ever rewrite the narrative, because the narrative had already been chosen. I was the contingency plan, the spare tire, the son you mention when the first one is unavailable. That night after the investors left and the staff cleared the dishes, I walked into the study where father and Ion were reviewing projections. The air smelled of leather and expensive tobacco. Ion did not look up when he spoke. You should learn to laugh at yourself, Omar. It makes things easier. Father glanced at me, waiting for submission. I met his eyes, and for the first time I did not search them for approval. I searched them for recognition. There was none, only calculation. I nodded once and left the room. I went to the secondary office downtown, the one no one visited unless there was a problem. I sat at the long metal desk where I had spent years solving crises that never reached the boardroom, and I opened my laptop. There is a particular kind of silence that arrives when you stop hoping for fairness. It is not bitter, it is efficient. I logged into the private trust account our grandmother had established before she passed, a detail no one discussed because it did not flatter the chosen heir. She had divided her estate equally between us, but placed it under a clause that activated upon the death of our last surviving parent. Our father had suffered a stroke 2 weeks earlier. He was stable, but diminished. The doctors used words like precaution and recovery, but I had seen the tremor in his left hand and the confusion in his gaze when he forgot the names of minor clients. The clause would activate soon. I had always assumed when that day came we would stand together as brothers managing the inheritance jointly. I had assumed many things I no longer did. I reviewed the trust documents, slowly reading every line as if they were instructions for a machine I was about to operate. The total liquid assets were substantial enough to alter the balance of power within Ramon Holdings if directed strategically. I closed the laptop and leaned back in the chair. The city outside the window pulsed with late traffic and distant sirens. I did not feel triumphant. I felt awake. The title "Family Mistake" echoed once more in my mind, but it no longer sank. It hovered, waiting to be redefined. I stood up, locked the office, and stepped into the night air. The decision was not dramatic, it was deliberate. I would not fight for a seat at a table where my worth was pre-written. I would build leverage quietly, precisely, and when the time came I would move, not out of revenge, but out of alignment with who I had always been. The sun in the shadows learns things the sun in the spotlight never notices, and the night my brother called me the family mistake was the night I stopped trying to be anything else and started preparing to become something they could not ignore. The weeks that followed did not look different from the outside. I still arrived at the warehouse before sunrise, still walked the concrete floors with a clipboard, still listened to drivers complain about fuel rates and customs delays, still sent weekly reports to a board that skimmed my numbers and praised my brother's charisma instead. But inside something had restructured itself. I no longer worked for approval, I worked for position. There is a difference, and it changes the way you breathe. Our father returned home from the hospital, thinner, slower, the authority in his voice slightly diluted, though he pretended otherwise. He resumed sitting at the head of the table during board meetings, but Ion spoke, more often finishing sentences father began correcting projections before father could process them. Investors noticed. They always do. Power shifts are rarely announced, they are observed in private. Ion had begun referring to the company as his future, not ours. I heard it first through an assistant who did not realize loyalty is a currency I value highly. She told me Ion had said once father steps back we streamline this place, no more sentimental positions. I did not ask what that meant. I already knew sentimental positions are the ones held by people who keep things functioning without spectacle. They are the easiest to cut and the hardest to replace. I continued reviewing the trust documents at night, memorizing clauses, tracing contingencies. Grandmother had been precise. She had not trusted appearances either. The clause activating the estate required medical confirmation of father's cognitive incapacity or his passing, whichever came first. I did not want my father dead. Despite everything, he was still the man who taught me how to ride a bicycle in the empty parking lot of the first warehouse, still the man who once stayed up all night helping me build a science project volcano that erupted exactly on cue, even if he later forgot that moment existed. But I could not ignore reality. His second stroke came on a Tuesday afternoon during a strategy session. He was mid-sentence when his words dissolved into air and his body followed him to the floor. I was In the logistics yard, when my phone vibrated, Ion never sounded small until that call. He said, "Only 2 words come now." By the time I reached the hospital, father was in intensive care, machines breathing in rhythm. He could no longer command the doctor spoke, carefully explaining partial paralysis, significant cognitive impairment, uncertain recovery. Ion stood beside the window, staring at the parking structure, as if calculating depreciation. He asked about board continuity, about signing authority, about investor confidence. I asked about therapy options, about long-term care, about whether father would recognize us if he woke. The doctor looked at me longer than he looked at Ion. "Sometimes the body survives," he said. "The mind negotiates its own terms." Father did not die that week, but something irreversible had occurred. The medical panel convened 2 days later, declared him unfit to resume executive duties. The clause activated with a signature and a stamp. I felt the weight of it, not as triumph, but as gravity. The trust transferred control of a diversified portfolio, including liquid capital, real estate stakes, and minority shares in Ramon Holdings, directly to Ion and me, equally divided, but independently managed. Grandmother had insisted on that detail. Independent management. It meant neither of us required the other's consent to allocate our portion. The total value was enough to shift voting power within the company if consolidated strategically. Ion seemed relieved when the legal briefing concluded. He assumed equality meant alignment. He put a hand on my shoulder in the conference room and said, "We will handle this together, brother. Finally, things are clear." His tone was almost warm, almost generous. I studied his face, searching for the boy who once split his allowance with me when I forgot mine at home. I found instead the man who had laughed across a chandelier-lit table and called me the shadow. He did not know that shadows lengthen when the sun lowers. I nodded. "We will handle what needs handling," I said. That night I did not go home. I went to the downtown office again. The metal desk, the city lights, the quiet. I opened the account summary and initiated the first transfer, not into Ramon Holdings, not into any structure bearing our family name, but into a newly registered entity, Ramon Infrastructure Solutions. The name was intentional, familiar enough to pass unnoticed, distinct enough to stand alone. I had incorporated it months earlier, a precaution I once would have called paranoid. Now I called it foresight. The transferred amount was significant enough to secure majority stakes in 2 mid-sized regional transport firms that had been struggling under debt. I knew their weaknesses. I had studied their routes, negotiated with their managers, shared tea in their break rooms when no one else from our company bothered. They trusted me, not the Ramon name. Me. By midnight, the paperwork was in motion. I leaned back and closed my eyes, not to celebrate, but to assess. There would be consequences. Ion would expect my capital to reinforce his consolidation plan. He had already drafted proposals to centralize authority, eliminate redundant divisions, reduce operational autonomy, which meant reduce me. If I allowed my inheritance to merge under his directive, I would cement my role permanently. Secondary, dependent, conditional. I refused to do that. I was not dismantling the family empire. I was diversifying my existence within it and beyond it. The following week, the board convened to appoint interim leadership. Ion was confirmed as acting chief executive officer unanimously. I abstained from voting, which surprised several members, but abstention can be louder than opposition. After the meeting, Ion cornered me in the hallway. "I hope you are not planning anything unnecessary," he said lightly. "Investors need unity." I agreed. "Investors do need unity," I said, "which is why diversification matters." He frowned, not fully understanding yet, but sensing deviation. "You are not equipped to run parallel operations, Omar," he said, not cruelly, just certain. "Stick to what you know." I held his gaze. "I know more than you think." The first acquisition under Ramon Infrastructure Solutions closed quietly within 3 weeks. The press release was minimal, framed as a strategic partnership rather than ownership. I retained existing management, granted them autonomy, injected capital to clear their highest interest debts. The second firm followed a month later. Combined, they controlled key regional corridors Ramon Holdings had long neglected as low margin, but I knew margin is not only measured in immediate profit, it is measured in leverage. Over the next 2 months, I secured contracts with 3 independent freight operators who had grown weary of Ion aggressive renegotiation tactics. They preferred stability over spectacle. I offered that stability does not make headlines, but it builds loyalty. I worked longer hours than ever before, splitting time between the main headquarters and the new entity, ensuring no visible conflict yet creating undeniable presence. The first time Ion realized the scale of what I was building was during a quarterly review when revenue projections from the neglected corridors exceeded expectations not under Ramon Holdings, but under Ramon Infrastructure Solutions. He stared at the numbers. Then at me. You used the inheritance. He said it was not a question. Yes, I replied. Silence stretched between us, not hostile, not yet, but charged. You should have coordinated with me. He said father would have wanted consolidation. Father wanted control. I answered, and control is not the same as strength. His jaw tightened. You think this makes you strong? I think it makes me accountable to myself. For a moment I saw something flicker in his expression, not anger, not even rivalry, but uncertainty. He had always measured himself against father's standards, never against mine, because I had never presented myself as a competitor. Now the equation had shifted, not publicly, not dramatically, but structurally. Investors began asking questions at dinners about the parallel growth strategy. Some praised the innovation, others warned about brand dilution. I answered calmly, outlining risk distribution, long-term scalability, independent revenue streams. Ion countered, emphasizing unified branding, centralized authority. The board listened more closely than before. They had assumed there was one heir. Now they saw two visions. I did not call him the family mistake. I did not need to labels lose power when outcomes speak. Instead, I continued building contract by contract, corridor by corridor, transferring resources, not recklessly, but deliberately. The trust had given me capital, but it was discipline that converted it into influence. Late one evening, as I stood alone in the headquarters lobby, the marble floors reflecting the city lights, I thought about the boy behind the study door, hearing himself reduced to contingency. I wished I could tell him that contingency plans sometimes become the most resilient structures, that being the shadow teaches you where the light fails. I did not know yet how this would end. I only knew I would never again accept a narrative written without my consent, and the night my brother called me the family mistake was no longer a wound. It was a reference point, a line dividing who I had been from who I was becoming, and I moved forward without asking permission. Power does not explode, it accumulates. It gathers in quiet corners, in signed contracts, in phone calls made after midnight when the louder voices have gone home. And over the next 6 months, I watched the balance inside Ramon Holdings begin to tilt, not publicly, not in a way that could be captured in headlines, but in the subtle mathematics of influence. My parallel corridors started feeding traffic into ports we had once ignored, and competitors who used to negotiate only with Ion began requesting meetings with me instead, not because I was louder, but because I listened, and in business being heard is often more valuable than being seen. Ion responded the only way he knew how. He accelerated. He pushed for rapid expansion into international markets, leveraging debt to finance visibility campaigns, glossy announcements, strategic partnerships that looked impressive on paper. Investors applauded at first. Growth always sounds like genius before it reveals its cost. I attended every board meeting, still seated slightly to the left, never at the head, but no longer at the end, and when projections were presented, I asked careful questions about cash flow sustainability, about interest exposure, about contingency reserves. I did not challenge, I inquired. An inquiry is far more destabilizing than accusation. The first crack appeared in the fourth quarter, when a major overseas client delayed payment citing regulatory reviews. The debt servicing schedule did not delay with it. I saw the tension in Ion's shoulders, the way he pressed his thumb into the table when he thought no one noticed. Father remained at home in a private care suite. His speech limited, his eyes sometimes sharp, sometimes lost. I visited him twice a week. I updated him on operations even when he could not fully respond, and sometimes when I mentioned a warehouse or a route, his fingers would twitch as if memory traveled faster than language. I never told him about the word mistake. I never needed to. It lived in the architecture of everything. Around this same time, an opportunity surfaced that would test more than strategy. It was an infrastructure bid for a government-backed logistics hub connecting 3 provinces, a contract large enough to redefine market dominance. Ramon Holdings was the obvious contender, but so was Ramon Infrastructure Solutions because of our regional corridor control. The conflict was unavoidable. The board assumed we would submit a unified proposal under the original company banner. Ion called me into the study, the same room where I once overheard my designation as heir. The leather chairs were the same, the air still heavy with history. We cannot compete against ourselves, he said. It weakens perception. We submit one bid under Ramon Holdings. You fold your corridors into the main structure for this contract, and afterward, we can revisit independences. Tone suggested generosity as if independence were a hobby he had allowed me to explore. I stood by the bookshelf, where father used to keep annual reports dating back decades. If I fold the corridors, now I lose leverage. I said. Leverage against who? He asked. Against instability, I replied. He exhaled sharply. You're afraid of risk. I am aware of it. He leaned forward. This contract will secure our dominance. For 10 years it requires scale, it requires unity. I met his gaze. Unity is not absorption. Ion 4. The first time the conversation was not layered in politeness, it was direct. He stood and walked toward the window. You have always mistaken caution for wisdom, he said softly. Father built this company by betting everything more than once, and he nearly lost it twice. I answered. You were too young to see that. I was not accusing, I was remembering. He turned back toward me, eyes sharper than I had seen in months. If you submit a separate bid, it will be seen as betrayal, he said. The word hovered between us. Betrayal is a heavy word, especially in families where love is conditional. I thought about the dinners, the laughter, the shadow. I thought about grandmother drafting independent management into her will as if she foresaw this exact moment. I am not submitting against you, I said. I am submitting alongside you. The government will choose what it considers stronger. He shook his head. You want to prove something? I paused. Maybe I do. The bids were prepared in parallel. Media outlets speculated about internal competition, framing it as rivalry between brothers, though neither of us commented publicly. Investors grew nervous. Stock volatility increased slightly, not catastrophic, but noticeable. The board requested a joint statement affirming mutual respect. We delivered it standing side by side in front of cameras, smiling with the precision of men who understand optics. Behind the scenes, tension tightened like wire. I increased liquidity reserves, anticipating turbulence, while Ion doubled down on expansion, confident that scale would overshadow caution. When the day of the announcement arrived, the entire executive floor gathered around the central screen. Government officials praised innovation, resilience, regional integration. They announced the winning bidder, Ramon Infrastructure Solutions. For a moment there was no sound, no applause, no protest, just the faint hum of air conditioning. I did not smile. I did not look at Ion. I kept my posture steady as officials outlined why the decentralized corridor control and lower debt exposure created a more sustainable framework. It was not a rejection of Ramon Holdings. It was an endorsement of prudence. The room slowly exhaled. Some board members began calculating what this meant for voting power, for revenue streams, for leadership legitimacy. Ion expression remained composed, but his hands were clasped so tightly the knuckles had drained of color. Congratulations, he said, finally extending his hand. I accepted it. Thank you, I replied. And in that handshake lived every unspoken sentence of our childhood. The contract required collaboration despite separate ownership structures, forcing our companies into operational interdependence. The irony was sharp. The brother built for the stage now had to coordinate with the one built for the shadows, except the shadow now controlled the central artery of growth. In the weeks that followed, industry publications shifted their language. They no longer referred to me as the quieter Ramon. They called me strategic. They called me disciplined. They called me decisive. Words that once attached only to Ion began drifting toward my column. Public perception is a fragile currency. It moves quickly when evidence supports it. At home, father watched coverage from his chair, eyes following the screen as analysts discussed our divergent approaches. One evening, as I adjusted his blanket, he gripped my wrist, unexpectedly strong, and whispered in a fractured voice, "Both of you strong." His words were imperfect, but intentional. I swallowed whatever response tried to rise and simply nodded. It was the closest thing to acknowledgement I had ever received, yet victory did not taste sweet. It tasted necessary. I did not want to defeat my brother. I wanted to exist without diminishment. There is a difference, but it is difficult to explain in boardrooms where metrics replace emotion. Tension between Ion and me became quieter, more controlled. We spoke in measured tones, discussed timelines, budgets, compliance, as if our history were an irrelevant footnote. But history is never irrelevant. It informs every pause, every emphasis. One night, long after staff had left, I found him alone in the conference room, lights off, city glowing through the glass. "You could have told me earlier how far you planned to go," he said, without turning. "Would you have listened?" I asked. He did not answer immediately. "I thought you needed guidance," he said finally. "I did not trust you to carry weight." I stepped closer. "I was carrying weight long before you noticed." He nodded once slowly, as if absorbing something uncomfortable. "Maybe I was wrong," he said the admission was small, but significant in families like ours. Apologies are rare, they are replaced by strategic recalibrations. Still the sentence lingered between us, not absolution, not reconciliation, but recognition, and in that recognition I realized something unexpected. I no longer needed him to see me differently to feel whole. I had already redefined myself through action. The word mistake had lost its structure. It no longer framed my decisions, it merely marked the origin of a transformation. As the logistics hub construction began and contracts solidified, the industry narrative shifted from rivalry to dual leadership, from competition to complementary strength. Investors stabilized, confidence returned, and internally the board initiated discussions about restructuring voting shares to reflect current revenue distribution, which meant my influence would formalize not just functionally, but legally. I did not rush the process, I allowed it to unfold, because true power does not scramble at positions and weights. The boy behind the door had grown into a man who understood that shadows are not evidence of weakness, they are proof of light, and as I stood on the unfinished platform of the new hub watching cranes carve steel into sky, I felt something unfamiliar, not triumph, not revenge, but balance, and balance is a far more durable form of victory. Balance is fragile when pride is involved, and even though the industry began calling us complementary forces inside the walls of our own headquarters, the air carried an undercurrent that could not be measured in revenue charts. The board restructuring discussions moved from informal conversations to drafted proposals. Voting shares would be recalibrated based on performance over the previous fiscal cycle, which meant my independent entity now held measurable influence within the parent company, not through inheritance, not through sentiment, but through documented growth. Some members welcomed this evolution, calling it modernization. Others feared it diluted traditional hierarchy. What they meant was it diluted Ion. I watched him during those meetings, composed, articulate, still every inch the leader he had trained himself to be. Yet something in his cadence had shifted. He no longer dismissed my projections, he analyzed them. He no longer joked at my expense, he referenced my data. The change was subtle but undeniable. Respect born from necessity is still respect, though it arrives without warmth outside the company. Construction on the logistics hub accelerated. The scale of it was almost symbolic. Steel beams rising from ground that had once been dismissed as unprofitable, connecting routes long considered secondary into a central artery of commerce. When I walked the site with engineers and regional managers, I felt the quiet satisfaction of integration, not domination. The corridors I had nurtured in obscurity were now foundational infrastructure, and every truck that would one day pass through that hub would do so because I refused to disappear. Meanwhile, Ramon Holdings carried the weight of its earlier expansion. The overseas client eventually paid, but the delay had exposed vulnerabilities. Credit lines tightened, analysts asked sharper questions during earnings calls. Ion handled them with skill, but I could see the strain accumulating in the space between his words. One evening he requested we review long-term strategy privately, not in the study, not in the boardroom, but on the rooftop terrace, where we used to sit as boys watching airplanes carve lines across the sky. The city stretched beneath us, glowing. Indifferent to family dynamics. I underestimated you, he said, without preamble, not your intelligence, but your patience. I thought you would eventually demand recognition loudly. I did not realize you were building it silently. I leaned against the railing. I was not building against you, I said. I was building beyond limitation. He nodded, absorbing the distinction. I thought being chosen meant being superior, he admitted. I did not see how much of your work made my leadership possible. The honesty in his voice did not erase the past, but it reframed it. We stood there in shared silence, the kind that once felt oppressive, now simply reflective. Then he asked the question that had hovered unspoken since the night of the chandelier dinner, do you still see yourself as the mistake? I considered it carefully. The word no longer pierced, but it remained part of my origin. I see myself as the contingency that became capacity, I answered. He exhaled, something close to a laugh. That sounds like something grandmother would say. We both knew she had anticipated fractures long before they surfaced. Her insistence on independent management had not been accidental. It had been protective, not of wealth, but of dignity. As the share restructuring vote approached, tension resurfaced, not between us, but within the extended family, uncles, cousins, minor stakeholders who had aligned themselves with Ion as the presumed singular heir now feared dilution of their influence. They began lobbying privately, questioning whether My parallel entity represented divided loyalty. The implication was clear blood should consolidate, not diversify. I attended a family dinner where the undercurrents surfaced openly. An uncle suggested unity required sacrifice sometimes. The quieter son must support the louder one for the sake of legacy. I listened without interruption, then responded, legacy that cannot survive evolution is nostalgia, not strength. The table fell, still the same room that once echoed with polite laughter at my expense now weighed my words carefully. Power alters acoustics. The vote passed 2 weeks later, not unanimously, but decisively. My voting shares within Ramon Holdings increased, reflecting the revenue contribution of Ramon Infrastructure Solutions. It was a structural acknowledgement that could not be undone by tone or tradition. When the official documentation was signed, I felt neither vindication nor superiority, only completion. A line drawn years ago had been redrafted through persistence. Father watched the news summary from his chair that evening. His speech had improved, slightly fragmented, but intentional. When the anchor mentioned dual leadership, he turned his head toward me, and with visible effort formed a single word: equal. It was not an apology, it was not an endorsement of one over the other, it was recognition, and for the first time I did not have to translate it through doubt. Yet balance invites its final test. Crisis arrived without warning. A regulatory investigation into procurement practices across multiple logistics firms swept through the industry, sparked by allegations unrelated to us, but broad enough to include every major operator, including Ramon Holdings and my independent entity. Auditors descended, files were requested, transactions scrutinized, media speculation intensified, hinting at possible irregularities, though none were specified. Stock prices wavered again, and this time the risk was reputational, not financial. In moments like this, fractures either widen or fuse. Ion called an emergency strategy meeting, expecting unified defense. I arrived with complete transparency, full documentation from my corridors, every contract, every compliance record meticulously archived, because caution had never left my vocabulary. As external auditors reviewed months of data, it became evident that while minor procedural lapses existed industry-wide, our operations remained substantively clean. The investigation cleared us, publicly noting strong internal controls, particularly within the decentralized regional framework. Analysts praised our governance structure, highlighting how diversified oversight reduced systemic risk. Ironically, the very independence once criticized became our shield. When the clearance announcement aired, I watched Ion during the press conference. He did not position himself alone at the podium. He gestured for me to stand beside him, and when a journalist asked about internal rivalry, he answered without hesitation, "There is no rivalry, only responsibility." My brother ensured that responsibility was distributed wisely. The sentence was deliberate and public. It traveled farther than any private apology ever could. After the conference, as cameras powered down, he turned to me and said, "I should have said that years ago." Perhaps he should have, but timing shapes impact. Had he spoken those words before I built capacity, they would have sounded like charity. Now they sounded like truth. Weeks later, as the logistics hub prepared for its inaugural launch ceremony, dignitaries gathered, investors assembled, and a stage was erected at the center of steel and concrete that had once been dismissed as secondary ground. Ion and I stood side by side, awaiting introduction. I remembered the 19-year-old behind the study door, the 31-year-old at the chandelier table, the countless mornings in warehouses where recognition never arrived, and I realized something quietly profound. None of those moments were wasted. They were apprenticeship, not to a title, but to self-definition. When my name was announced alongside his, it did not feel like elevation, it felt like alignment. The applause that followed was not for a redeemed mistake nor for a dethroned error. It was for integration of strengths long separated by perception. As I stepped forward to speak, I did not reference rivalry or vindication. I spoke about resilience, about infrastructure that connects overlooked paths into central routes, about how systems grow stronger when they honor every component, not just the visible ones. The words were simple, but they carried years within them, and as the ribbon fell and engines roared to life behind us, I understood that the night my brother called me the family mistake had not been the moment of my diminishment, it had been the ignition point of my autonomy. The shadow had not disappeared, it had expanded into foundation, and foundation does not demand spotlight, it sustains it. Foundation changes the way a man stands, and after the launch of the hub, something inside our family recalibrated in ways that could not be captured by stock prices or media coverage. The company stabilized under dual leadership, and the narrative of rivalry dissolved into something more complex, something quieter. Investors no longer asked who would inherit the empire, they asked how the partnership would evolve, and evolution is a different kind of pressure because it requires humility, not dominance. Ion and I began meeting weekly without agenda, without assistance, without polished presentations. We sat across from each other in the same study that once framed our imbalance, and we spoke not as heir and contingency, but as architects examining structure. There were still disagreements, sharp ones about expansion pace, about automation investments, about risk tolerance, but the arguments no longer carried childhood in their undertones, they carried strategy, and that difference is the line between resentment and respect. Father Health continued its uneven rhythm, some days lucid enough to follow financial summaries, other days adrift in fragments of memory. One afternoon, I found him staring at an old photograph of the first warehouse, a corrugated metal structure with faded paint and a single delivery truck parked outside. He motioned for me to sit. His voice trembled, but his gaze held clarity. "I pushed you wrong," he said slowly. The words arrived with effort, each syllable carved from pride. I waited, not wanting to interrupt what had taken him decades to assemble. "I thought pressure makes diamond," he continued. "I forgot pressure also breaks glass." I felt something tighten in my chest, not anger, not triumph, but release. "I was not glass," I said gently. "I was steel." He nodded faintly, perhaps in agreement, perhaps simply in fatigue, but the admission settled something unfinished between us. That evening I told Ion about the conversation. He listened without defensiveness, without explanation, just absorption. "I spent my whole life trying to be his diamond," he said quietly. "Maybe that was my mistake." The word hung between us, transformed from weapon into reflection. We had both been shaped by expectation, just in different directions. He toward brilliance, I toward endurance. Neither path had been easy, only different. The industry moved forward, competitors adjusted to our model, some imitating decentralization, others doubling down on consolidation. We expanded cautiously into neighboring regions, integrating technology platforms that improved route efficiency without sacrificing autonomy. I ensured regional managers retained decision-making authority because I remembered what invisibility felt like, and I refused to replicate it under my name. Employees who once avoided eye contact in corridors now approached with ideas, knowing they would be heard. Recognition distributed becomes culture, and culture sustains beyond personalities. Yet no assent is without final reckoning. The extended family, who had once lobbied for singular control, began proposing a public offering, arguing that taking Ramon Holdings fully public would maximize valuation and secure generational wealth. The proposal was financially attractive, strategically ambitious, and personally disruptive because public markets reward spectacle and compress nuance. Dual leadership might be interpreted as instability by analysts hungry for singular narratives. Ion was intrigued. I was cautious, not out of fear, but memory. I knew how quickly perception can distort identity. During a private strategy retreat, we debated the implications for hours. He argued that transparency would validate our evolution. I countered that scrutiny could reignite comparisons we had just learned to outgrow. Eventually, he asked a question stripped of ego: "If we go public, will you feel overshadowed again?" I considered the honesty behind it and answered with equal clarity: "Not if we anchor governance in structure, not personality." We negotiated terms that embedded distributed authority into corporate bylaws, ensuring no single executive could consolidate unchecked power regardless of market pressure. It was a safeguard born from experience, not suspicion. When the announcement of our intent to explore an IPO reached the press, reactions were swift. Analysts praised the governance model, citing it as progressive. Others speculated about sibling dynamics, attempting to resurrect an old storyline that no longer applied. This time, neither of us reacted defensively. We had learned that identity built on outcome does not fracture under commentary. As preparations advanced, roadshows scheduled, disclosures drafted, I found myself revisiting the rooftop terrace alone one evening, watching aircraft trace luminous paths across the sky. The city beneath felt both familiar and distant. I thought about the arc from contingency to capacity, from shadow to foundation, and I realized something unexpected. I no longer carried the need to prove anything, not to my father, not to my brother, not to the board. The work itself had become expression enough. The word mistake had dissolved completely. Not erased, but repurposed into a reminder of what misjudgment can awaken when met with discipline. Ion joined me, eventually standing beside me without announcement. "Do you ever wish we had grown up differently?" he asked. "Sometimes," I replied, "but if we had, I might never have discovered who I am." He nodded, "And I might never have learned that leadership without listening is performance." We stood there not as rivals reconciled nor as archetypes corrected, but as men refined by friction. The IPO process would demand resilience, the markets would fluctuate, commentators would speculate, but none of that felt existential anymore, because the internal imbalance that once defined us had been resolved through action, not apology. Weeks later, during a final family gathering before formal filings were submitted, extended relatives offered cautious congratulations, their earlier certainties replaced by measured respect. I observed them without resentment, understanding that perception follows evidence, rarely preceding it. That night, as the house quieted and I walked through halls that once amplified hierarchy, I paused outside the study door, remembering the 19-year-old who overheard his future reduced to error. I wished I could tell him that the label would one day lose its gravity, that strength often incubates in obscurity, that being underestimated is not curse, but camouflage. The empire we were preparing to introduce to public markets was no longer a monument to singular ambition, it was an ecosystem built on complementary forces, risk balanced by restraint, vision stabilized by vigilance, and in that ecosystem, I did not occupy shadow or spotlight, I occupied alignment. The night my brother called me, the family mistake had set in motion a sequence neither of us understood then. It had forced me inward where capacity grows without applause, and forced him outward where humility waits beyond confidence. Now, as signatures dried on preliminary filings and the future widened before us, I felt not victory, not vindication, but equilibrium. And equilibrium is the quietest form of power because it does not need to announce itself to be felt. Equilibrium does not mean the storms stop, it means you no longer fear them, and the months leading to our public offering tested that truth in ways no private rivalry ever could. Market conditions shifted unexpectedly, a global slowdown tightened liquidity across sectors, and advisors began suggesting we delay the listing. Analysts questioned whether a family-led logistics group could maintain cohesion under shareholder scrutiny. Old narratives resurfaced in financial columns hinting at sibling tension packaged as cautionary forecasting. I read every line without flinching, because this time the speculation did not define me, it simply described a version of us that no longer existed. Ion and I met daily, reviewing projections, recalibrating valuation ranges, adjusting timelines with patience rather than panic. The board watched closely, expecting fracture under pressure, but what they witnessed instead was rhythm. He pushed when momentum was necessary, I anchored when restraint preserved stability. The interplay that once felt like competition had matured into coordination, and coordination is far less dramatic, but far more powerful. Father Health declined gradually through that season, his awareness flickering like a light nearing dusk. Some days he recognized both of us clearly, asking precise questions about debt ratios and expansion corridors. Other days, he drifted into silence, eyes tracing ceilings only he could interpret. One evening, as rain pressed softly against the windows, I sat beside him alone in the dim room. He looked at me with unusual steadiness and whispered, "I was hard on you." The sentence was fragile, but complete. I did not rush to fill the space afterward, because some admissions deserve silence around them. I learned strength from it, I answered finally, "Not the kind you expected, but the kind I needed." A faint curve touched his mouth, perhaps pride, perhaps relief. In that moment, I understood something that had taken years to articulate. Parents project their unfinished battles onto their children, believing they are forging armor, when sometimes they are merely passing down weight. Forgiveness did not arrive as ceremony, it arrived as comprehension. I saw him not as the architect of my diminishment, but as a man shaped by his own fears of failure and scarcity, and that understanding dissolved the last residue of resentment I carried. Ion joined us later, standing on the opposite side of the bed, and for a rare moment the three of us occupied the same emotional ground. Not hierarchy, not rivalry, just shared lineage. Father eyes moved between us, and with effort he said, "Build together." It was the closest thing to instruction he had given without comparison. Weeks later, he passed quietly before dawn, the city still wrapped in gray. The funeral drew industry leaders, competitors, employees from warehouses and boardrooms alike, each offering Versions of respect that outline the magnitude of what he had built. As I stood beside Ion receiving condolences, I did not feel overshadowed nor elevated. I felt connected to a continuum that extended backward and forward simultaneously. After the mourning period, we faced a decision about the IPO. Advisors argued that postponement until market recovery would maximize valuation. Others insisted that demonstrating confidence during volatility could differentiate us. In private, Ion asked me what I believed, not as courtesy, but as reliance. I believe we proceed, I said, not because timing is perfect, but because structure is ready. Markets reward conviction when it is supported by governance, and ours is. The vote was unanimous this time, not out of deference, but alignment. The listing day arrived without spectacle inside our walls. We chose not to host extravagant celebrations. Only a modest gathering at headquarters, employees watching the market open on large screens as our company symbol appeared publicly for the first time. The initial trading hours were volatile, rising sharply, dipping, then stabilizing within projected range. Applause erupted across the floor, not for price, but for presence. We had stepped into a new arena without surrendering the principles that rebalanced us. As cameras requested interviews and analysts dissected our governance model, one question repeated: do sibling dynamics complicate corporate leadership? I answered with calm clarity: siblings complicate childhood leadership, clarifies adulthood. The line traveled quickly across business media, not as provocation, but perspective. Ion echoed the sentiment in his own words, emphasizing that distributed authority had strengthened resilience, not diluted control. Watching him speak, I recognized the evolution not only in him, but in us. He no longer needed to occupy the entire frame to feel legitimate, and I no longer feared being cropped from it. That evening, long after markets closed and headlines circulated, I returned alone to the rooftop terrace. The city shimmered beneath a clear sky, airplanes tracing luminous arcs, just as they had when we were boys. I thought about the 19-year-old behind the study door, the 31-year-old at the chandelier table, the man at the metal desk, initiating a transfer that would redefine his trajectory. Each version of me had been necessary, none wasted. The word mistake felt distant, almost abstract, a relic from a narrative that had dissolved under evidence. I realized then that being called a mistake had been less about identity and more about perception, and perception can be re-engineered through consistency, not confrontation. Ion joined me quietly, carrying 2 glasses of water. No champagne, no theatrics, just simplicity. We did it, he said. We did, I replied, not as concession, but truth. The empire our father built with instinct and endurance had entered public markets with structure and balance. The shadow had not consumed the spotlight, nor had the spotlight erased the shadow. They had integrated into dimension, and in that dimension I found something I had never possessed. During all those years of striving, I found peace, not the fragile peace of avoidance, but the durable peace of self-definition. I no longer needed to outperform to feel worthy, nor to withdraw to feel safe. I stood in my own architecture, solid, not because others approved, but because I understood my foundation. If you are listening to this tonight, and you have ever been labeled less than, overlooked, underestimated, assigned a role that shrank your capacity, remember, the shadows are not evidence of absence, they are proof of light positioned somewhere behind you. Sometimes being the contingency prepares you to become the cornerstone. Sometimes the title meant to diminish you becomes the catalyst that disciplines your focus. I was called the family mistake, and for years I carried it like a verdict until I realized verdicts can be appealed through action, not argument. You do not have to fight every room to change how it sees you. Sometimes you simply have to build something it cannot ignore, and that is where I will leave you tonight. Thank you for listening to this story, for walking through every doubt, every decision, every quiet recalibration with me. If this journey resonated with you, if it reminded you of your own strength hidden beneath someone else's expectations, then stay connected, share your thoughts, and continue building your own foundation. This is Sophia Harper, and you have been listening to my channel. Until next time, remember, you are never the mistake, you are the momentum. Good night.